quick look down IMDb memory lane, I see that James Gunn was an uncredited writer in the 13 Ghosts remake, the 2001 haunted house film that starred Matthew Lillard, Shannon Elizabeth, and Antonio Scarpacci himself, Tony Shalhoub. This film was shit on by critics, fans, and was cast out to the wastelands of the forgotten horror films. Is 13 Ghosts the bastard film and the black sheep that everyone claims it to be? I think not. We start off in a haunted junkyard with ghost collector and enthusiast Cyrus, played by F. Murray Abraham, hunting the final ghost for his collection. This point sets the rest of the film into action and gives us all the key information we'll need going forward. The movie starts off in the most over-the-top way. We have the armed ghost hunters, the crazy windstorm, and a tanker truck full of blood.
It's amazing.
From here we meet the broken family, headed by Jack Jeebs himself, and are surprised to learn that they will inherit their deceased uncle's creepy mansion. It's an old school setup, because this is a remake of an old school film. Once we get to the mansion, the main story thread kicks in. The family, along with Matthew Lillard, gets trapped in the house as the ghosts are set free. We do get some cool practical effects, with the death of the lawyer, and we get some tense moments with the ghosts causing havoc throughout. This is the main strength of the film. It's wham bam thank you ma'am the whole way through. We get enough motivation from each character. Cyrus wants godlike powers, Tony Shalhoub wants to take care of his family, and a knowing nanny. And Matthew Lillard wants to atone for being responsible for most of the mess. It's not Shawshank-level motivation and character development, but it gives you enough reason to care, at least a little. The glass mansion acts as a prison for the ghosts, and doubles as an ancient machine. The trapped ghosts are used to power the house and gives the owner the power to master time, seeing the past and the future. They actually set up a very convincing and interesting story here. The house is made up of giant glass panes that move and set up the machine's true purpose. It's an ever-changing maze with murderous ghosts on the loose. What essentially is a fun ghost film is somewhat layered with the reveal of the true nature of this house. The set design alone is worth the 90 minutes here. The single best goddamn part of this movie are the ghosts. You may think, of course, but who's to say? After seeing Logan, can we not agree that the unsung hero of that masterpiece was Patrick Stewart?
On the road, only one meal and hardly any sleep. She's 11, I'm fucking 90.
Hugh Jackman was amazing, but Patrick Stewart. I'm just saying, you never know. But the ghosts here are fantastic, and if this film came out a few years later, we'd probably be treated to CGI glow sticks instead of actual human beings. Not only do they use practical makeup, but they use innovative techniques to film the ghosts. They light them with a cold white light, and they add a water-like reflection to them. Though not developed in the film, these ghosts are fleshed out with detailed and intricate backstories. Some of these stories could be movies of their own, and actually rival the movie they're in. The Jackal is a 19th century man who was committed to an insane asylum for attacking hookers. After going insane, a metal cage was placed around his head for protection, and he eventually died when the asylum caught fire. Knowing this adds a lot of weight to what was seen as just a creepy ghost. For example, the Hammer was a blacksmith who avenged the death of his family. He was murdered by the townsfolk by driving railroad spikes through his body. These backstories are rich, and it's a shame that they couldn't have been worked into the film. Another interesting, if not the most miscalculated part of this film, is the family. I'm surprised that Tony Shalhoub was cast as the main character. It's so weird to watch now, 16 years later, that he was the driving force of this movie. Hell, even back then it was weird. Late 90s, early 2000s had Josh Hartnett, Jared Leto, Jennifer Love Hewitt, and Neve Campbell leading the way. Even if the father character was the story's motivation, he'd be paired up with a younger, hotter kid. I respect that they wanted someone older to lead the film, but Antonio Scarpacci was a weird choice. They put in Shannon Elizabeth as his daughter, which makes sense as she was coming off her American Pie peak, but is surprisingly subdued here, and disappears in the second act. The best non-ghost part goes to Matthew Lillard, a staple of the time. He comes off bouncy and energetic, which fits the style and tone of the film. I know that he's a love-hate actor, and I understand that not everyone grew up with Scream, but he always seems lively, like he's having fun, and I also hear he's a decent guy. With the horror boom of the late 90s, Dark Castle Entertainment was formed with the original intent of updating William Castle's work for the 21st century. But the weak showing of House on Haunted Hill put a lot of pressure on 13 Ghosts, and 13 Ghosts didn't perform well. Dark Castle Entertainment survived with a more open branding, with a heavier dose of action. They eventually put out Gateway, Unknown, and Bullet to the Head. They left Matthew Lillard and Splinter in the past to be forgotten. I believe, as flawed as this film is, it accomplished its main goal, to entertain, and I have and will always love this film, scars and all. This may be controversial, and I'd love to debate it in the comments, but please, every now and then take a drink and just have some dumb fun. I'm convinced more and more that nowadays, some people just don't know how to have a good time.
How sweet! Fresh meat!
What are you interested in?
Dreams.
Dreams?
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw. And this week, well, we're taking a look at a childhood favorite of mine, a little movie called Dreamscape, starring Dennis Quaid, Kate Capshaw, who was, of course, at the time the future Mrs. Steven Spielberg, Christopher Plummer, Max von Sydow, Eddie Albert, and David Patrick Kelly of The Warriors, with music by Maurice Jarre, and it was directed by Joseph Rubin, who later on would go on to direct one of Julia Roberts' best early movies, Sleeping with the Enemy. So, in this movie, a psychic played by Dennis Quaid with some absolutely hideous hair and really bad choice in sweater wear, I think, is recruited by his former mentor, played by Max von Sydow, for a top secret program that involves the infiltration of dreams.
Let's pretend that a man, with a little help from science, could psychically project himself inside the dream of a sleeping person.
Little do either of them know, however, that a government agent, played by Christopher Plummer, is financing the program and intends to use it to assassinate the nightmare-plagued president of the United States of America, played by Eddie Albert. One of the things that's interesting about Dreamscape is that it was a studio acquisition way back in 1984. Now, studio acquisitions happen all the time at film festivals now, and I think we've gotten quite used to them, but they were very different in the 80s. Currently, most acquisitions are of prestige titles from film festivals like Sundance or TIFF, and most of the movies get picked up by indie divisions at best. But in the 80s, the pipeline wasn't quite as cluttered with movies as it is now, and movie studios needed product. So it wasn't rare for a big-time studio to put out a film that was independently financed if it had real commercial appeal. Such a movie was Dreamscape, which was independently produced for a relatively small budget, $6 million, but was also cast with a bunch of rising stars, including Dennis Quaid, who had just had a big success in, well, the critically maligned, but still pretty financially successful anyway, Jaws 3D. Plus, it co-starred Max von Sydow and Christopher Plummer, and Eddie Albert was in it. Add to the fact that Kate Capshaw, who was the love interest in the film, was also playing the love interest in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which was foreseen to be the biggest movie of 1984.
Oh, Indy. Oh, be gentle with me.
I could see why 20th Century Fox decided to pick this movie up. Quaid at the time was really being groomed for big-time stardom, with a lot of people predicting he would become the next Harrison Ford. Not only had he done Jaws 3D, but he had also done a movie called Tough Enough, and a movie that really got executives excited, The Right Stuff. Too bad then that Fox kind of dumped the movie into theaters, putting it out in the dead zone of summer back in 1984, where it opened quite poorly. It was not a financial success, but it still managed to gross around $12 million, which was twice the budget, and I suppose makes it moderately successful. But where the movie really did well was on video, and all involved easily recouped their money and turned a solid profit. But while I would say that Dreamscape is a cult hit to children of the 80s who grew up watching it, with children such as myself being the case, otherwise I think it's relatively unknown. So, Dreamscape was a childhood favorite of mine, but we know how it goes. Movies we loved as kids don't always hold up when we're adults. I mean, I really loved the movie Howard the Duck when I was 5, and we just did a What the Fuck Happened to Howard the Duck a couple weeks ago that goes to prove that there were a lot of things that were wrong with Howard the Duck, but I guess I still love it in a nostalgic kind of way.
That's it. No more Mr. Nice Duck.
My love of the film, though, from when I was a child, doesn't necessarily mean it's a good movie. So I was very nervous revisiting a movie that, even when I was a kid, I knew was a little bit cheesy. I mean, Dreamscape came out in 1984 and was probably dated by 1985 with its over-the-top synthy score and, you know, those sweaters that Dennis Quaid wears. Indeed, Dreamscape is a really wacky movie, but the thing is, the kitsch factor in this movie is tuned up so high that as cheesy as it is, it all comes around full circle and suddenly becomes cutting edge and cool if you look at it through the filter of nostalgia. If people like 1980s kind of throwbacks like Kung Fury, I think that in some ways Dreamscape plays out as like kind of the perfect 80s spoof movie.
You might say that.
Except that it's kind of the real deal. It actually was made in the 1980s and isn't really a spoof. I mean, it was meant to be a serious movie. The only thing is, 30 some odd years later, it just seems kind of laughable, but in a good way. In fact, I think if a studio like A24 was to team up with a really cool director and they wanted to make a deliberately cheesy 80s movie, it probably would come out almost exactly like Dreamscape. This movie has all the hallmarks of the cheesy 80s genre, from a wildly over-the-top synth score by the great Maurice Jarre, who in his early days composed movies like Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia, but by the 80s had actually become something of a synthesizer specialist with the score for this, the amazing score for Witness, and a couple others under his belt. You got a saxophone playing wise guy hero played by the oddly coiffed Dennis Quaid. He spots this preppy look in the film that's totally contrary to the cool guy look that made him a heartthrob just a couple of years later in The Big Easy and Inner Space. It feels like Quaid at the time just didn't quite figure out his look. The short hair, devil-may-care look, I think, was what really pulled Dennis Quaid over. His look here is very strange. I mean, I guess they're trying to make him look like he's a college student or something, but I don't know, I find he looks very strange throughout this. It does kind of work, though, for the character, because I suppose he's supposed to be kind of an overgrown kid in some ways.
Friends?
Friends. You treasures.
I was half expecting him to walk around with a pocket protector, though, which is kind of strange because he's, again, this cool guy hero. I mean, like I said, he plays a saxophone. You don't get much cooler than that in the 80s. Saxophone means you were a pretty cool guy.
You play music with this thing?
That's a matter of opinion.
Kate Capshaw is the serious academic who immediately melts into his arms because, of course, he's Dennis Quaid.
So, Jane, what you do here in effect is count boners.
While Max von Sydow, in one of his many forays into genre in the 80s, is cast against type as one of the good guys. Usually in a movie like this, Max von Sydow would be evil. Here he's actually kind of a likable guy, but of course he gets killed pretty early in the film. Christopher Plummer is actually the baddie. Yes, that's right, Canadian icon Christopher Plummer.
It's very simple. Either you work for me or you die.
But the movie is absolutely stolen by this actor named David Patrick Kelly, who specialized in playing scumbag villains all throughout the 80s.
You may not know it to look at me, but I'm a pretty sensitive guy.
You'll remember him as Sully from Commando with that famous scene.
Remember, Sally, when I promised to kill you last?
That's right, Major. You did.
I lied.
Then, of course, there was The Adventures of Ford Fairlane, but the movie that really made him famous was The Warriors, when he does that great scene.
Warriors, come out to play.
So, Kelly in this movie plays Quaid's evil counterpart, the only other psychic that's powerful enough to enter dreams on his own without the kind of weird equipment that they use in the film. This makes him Plummer's tool for a presidential assassination plot. You see, Eddie Albert in this plays the US president, and he's haunted by the death of his wife and has terrifying visions of her dying in an awful nuclear holocaust that are so convincing that he's actually prepping disarmament talks with the Soviet Union. Remember, this was the 80s. That could, gasp, end the Cold War. He's like the anti-Reagan.
My responsibility to bring the world back from the brink. This nuclear madness has to end.
Of course, that means he has to die. It adds up to a fun caper that's partly a horror movie, especially in the midsection where Quaid helps a kid that's played by visions of a snake man, and partly an action-adventure movie, and also partly a sci-fi thriller/romance. So no matter how you slice it, Dreamscape is pretty good fun, and notable in that it was only the second movie ever to earn a PG-13 rating, with Red Dawn being the first. A strange byproduct of the rating is that different versions of the movie exist out there. I vividly remember the VHS version of this movie having some nice nudity, but the new Blu-ray version of the film is nudity-free, so I guess it got cut out at some point. Blech.
I'm not gonna go to bed with you.
Bed. Oh, bed. Who said anything about bed? I'm talking about linguini here.
There's a lot of really cool imagery in Dreamscape. One of the most notable is, of course, the Snake Man. That, of course, gave me nightmares as a kid. But watching the movie again, what really strikes me is the awesome opening scene, where right after the credits, you're plunged into the president's nuclear nightmare, which is rough stuff for a PG-13. And I think if this movie was released nowadays, it would easily get an R. It's such a striking moment. So while Dreamscape is definitely a product of its time, meaning the 80s, it can't be denied that as far as sci-fi horror goes, the 80s were kinda rad, and Dreamscape is a super fun retro flick that I definitely recommend checking out, especially if you like this kind of thing. In fact, I recommended Runaway a couple weeks ago, and if you liked my recommendation for Runaway, give Dreamscape a look.
Alex, have a heart.
How sweet! Fresh meat!
Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, starring Tom Atkins as a troubled doctor who stumbles upon an evil plan hatched by a diabolical CEO of the Silver Shamrock Novelties Company, where on Halloween night, the masks they've created for children come to life and kill their wearers. Now, in addition to Tom Atkins, this co-stars Stacey Nilkin and Dan O'Herlihy, who you may all remember as the old man from RoboCop, and it's written and directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, a close collaborator of the director of the original Halloween, John Carpenter, who returned to do the score with frequent co-composer Alan Harwath. Now, following Halloween 2, John Carpenter, who was already reluctant to participate in a sequel, decided that Michael Myers had run his course. Oh, how little did he know.
Oh shit!
Instead, his idea was to turn the Halloween franchise into a series of anthology movies that could be loosely connected by the holiday, but also be completely independent of each other. To that end, Carpenter took a step back, hiring Tommy Lee Wallace to write and direct the new film, which departed from the slasher formula and took the film into the world of witchcraft and science fiction. With Carpenter favorite Tom Atkins as his leading man and a very modest $2.5 million budget, Wallace made a pretty interesting little movie that's wholly original compared to the first two movies. Despite a few good reviews though, the movie tanked at the box office, only grossing $14 million, which isn't bad for such a cheap film, but far less than what Universal was anticipating. Apparently, fans were disappointed that Michael Myers wasn't in it, and ever since, he's been a constant presence in the franchise. There are still people that come up to me and say they hate Halloween 3 because it didn't have Michael Myers in it. I tell them that that was 25 to 30 years ago. Get over it. We had a wonderful time making it, and I think it's a good standalone movie. John Carpenter originally wanted to make a story every Halloween that would be different, but the producers said no because Michael Myers is making so much money. They told him that we could shoot Halloween 3, but then they're done with those different stories. Now, like many of the movies that I've featured in this series, I'm not going to argue that Halloween 3 Season of the Witch is some kind of ignored masterpiece. But if you're a fan of vintage-era John Carpenter and 80s horror, this is the perfect film. Now, Carpenter did not direct it, but Tommy Lee Wallace was his protege and his handprints are all over it. This feels like a vintage John Carpenter movie. For one thing, we get one of his patented synth scores, co-written with his frequent 80s collaborator Alan Harwath. Now, together these two guys also did the soundtrack for Big Trouble in Little China and a bunch of other John Carpenter classics. The importance of this can't be overstated, as anyone familiar with his music knows it gives his movies a pulse that's as strong as anything else. They also have the original's Dean Cundy as the DP, so even if Michael Myers isn't around, this still feels like a Halloween movie, although a lot of people thought that Halloween should have never actually been part of the title. Tom Atkins himself said it should have just been called Season of the Witch and not put Halloween with it at all, because if it doesn't have Michael Myers, then people thought, what the hell is this? Over time, it's become very popular on its own, as it had always intended to be. It's curious to wonder how this may have fared had it just been called Season of the Witch, but at the same time, Halloween as a franchise was a double-edged sword. They wanted the fans to come in, but they also knew that these same fans wouldn't be getting a Michael Myers movie. It'd be like doing a Jaws movie without a shark. It's worth noting, though, that Daniel Challis, CEO of Silver Shamrock, is way more evil than Michael Myers ever was in the first place. Now, Michael Myers is just a blunt tool. He just kills without reason. Daniel Challis, CEO of this company, wants a big body count. He wants to use pagan magic to kill thousands of children with his evil masks. I mean, this is not a nice guy. Hurley became very well known to my generation a couple of years later as the old man in RoboCop, and he's absolutely perfect as the baddie with this kind of Irish charm that hides the fact that, well, he's pretty damn evil.
It was the start of the year in our old Celtic lands, and we'd be waiting in our houses of wattles and clay. The barriers would be down, you see, between the real and the unreal.
I have to say, also love Tom Atkins as our everyman hero. He's a familiar figure from 80s action movies. He's in Lethal Weapon as Murtaugh's old friend from Vietnam, who gets killed pretty early on. And to me, there's something very authentic about Atkins in all of his 80s films. That maybe he's a little too surly, a little too drunk, and a little too hungover all the time to be playing a doctor, even a burnt out one, but he's kind of an awesome anti-hero, and no one can say that he doesn't play the part to the hilt. I mean, that last scene where he's screaming into the phone, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" is pretty great. Now, being the 80s, there's also tons of gratuitous nudity and some really creative gore in this one. So, if you're a fan of that kind of exploitation, well, this one's right up your alley. It's a shame that Carpenter's anthology plan didn't work out, and a few more fun one-offs like this one would have been way better than the mediocre Halloween sequels we got over the next 20 years, although I have to say, the franchise certainly was given new life last year with David Gordon Green's new version of Halloween, and, well, we've got 2 more Michael Myers movies on the way. Now, one thing I should mention about Halloween 3 Season of the Witch is that if you watch this movie, Silver Shamrock's little jingle is going to get implanted in your head, and you're not going to be able to forget it. I mean, it's a very, 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 very catchy, but also very, very, very annoying tune. Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween.
Happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
When I worked at Blockbuster Video, a friend of mine, Ruel, he used to sing this song all the time when he would get really upset. So we'd be working the cash together, and then I knew that the pressure was getting to be too much for him when he would start going, "Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock." At this point, even though he was my manager, I'd have to send him into the back room, take a little break because, well, I mean, if you've seen this movie, whenever the song plays, bad things happen, right? I didn't want that to happen in real life. Now, my favorite scene in this movie is when Tom Atkins winds up captured by O'Hurley's goons, and they explain their whole diabolical plan, giving Atkins a ghoulish demonstration on an annoying wholesaler of Silver Shamrock products. And that jingle, I mean, you listen to it once and you can't forget it. You just can't. Now, if you want to see Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, it's easily available on most streaming sites and on DVD and Blu-ray, but I have to say there are still a lot of people that hate this movie. I wrote it up a couple of years ago and the comments were so bad that, well, we had to turn the comments off on this one because people still, I don't know why, harbor really, really strong sentiments against it, even though the movie came out in 1982. I still love it, and I think that if you take away the name Halloween, this is just a great 80s horror movie on its own 2 feet, and I really enjoy it, and I've always enjoyed returning to it. It's cheesy, but again, it's a lot of fun. It's not a classic, but on its own merits, you can't go wrong watching it, or especially around this time of year. For me, it's one of the great hidden gems in John Carpenter's filmography, and I recommend checking it out for a good time. Until next time, I'm Chris Bumbre for JoBlo.com.